Sisters in Crime is delighted to welcome you tonight to Crime Without Borders. It's the first event for 2023 and that's worth celebrating, isn't it? Yeah. And I think Sisters in Crime is really pleased that you're all here because of the new ticketing system and arrangements with this hotel that we've all been coming to since Cocky was an egg. So well done for negotiating the new arrangements. So please welcome Ellie Marney.
Thank you.
A.M. Stuart, otherwise known as Alison, and Louise Bassett. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Janice Simpson, so I'm going to be the interlocuteur for tonight. Very loud. Shall I speak a little quieter? So let's begin by acknowledging the Kulin Nation people, the elders past and present on whose lands we're meeting this evening on behalf of Sisters in Crime Australia. So we respectfully acknowledge our traditional owners. What we're going to do is we're going to have these wonderful writers speak up until about 9 o'clock. Then we have a bit of a break. We have the raffle. Carmel's waving at me. Is it because my underpants are showing, or
Go a little bit later.
I could go a little bit later because we're starting a little later. Okay. What is the time?
It's 8:25.
Oh, 8:25. So we may go a little later. We may have a shorter break, but during the break we need to buy raffle tickets because there are fantastic prizes to be won in the traditional Sisters in Crime raffle. Feel free to move your chairs around if you want to. You know, you can make it into a sort of Colosseum type arrangement.
Maybe we fight to the death.
Leave the lions.
You also need to be ready with questions for our authors after the break. And indeed, there is a prize for the best question. And Jill Thomas, who's one of the administrators of Sisters in Crime, thanks Jill, she will be judging the best question, so if anybody wants to win one of the prizes really badly, that's Jill over there. Open to bribes, Jill? No. Oh, okay. So tonight's prize is a double pass to hear Nikki French in conversation with Vicky Petratus. Sorry, Vicky. And that's at Cinema Nova in Lygon Street, Carlton, on Thursday the 23rd of Feb. Yeah. So a bit after 10 o'clock or whenever the stuff is all finished up here, you fall down the stairs and have another drink with Carmel and the gang. Okay? So let's formally introduce our panel. Ellie Marney is a MPIA, as is Alison, and that stands for a multi-published international author. And I'd like to thank Alison for giving me that term earlier when we were sitting down. I just acronised it, you know, to make it, you know, sort of so WEFO, West Footscray, for those of you who don't know. So Ellie's a New York Times best-selling author of crime, and her titles include This Cracker, The Killing Code, which Deb and Christine have got for sale up there. And there's, you've published 11 novels, is that right?
My 11th comes out in June, yeah.
Microphone.
Oh.
My 11th comes out in June.
Thanks, Ellie. So she's won both Scarlet Stilettos and Davitt Awards, and she spent a lifetime researching in mortuaries. How lucky is Ellie?
It's pretty cool.
Very cool.
Interviewing law enforcement officers, and I've heard some of them are quite handsome, and asking former people who make explosives, spies who make explosives from household items, how they do it. Now, fortunately for you, Ellie doesn't live in Melbourne, so she's not experimenting in her own garage here. Quite a relief, really. Living sedately near Guildford. Louise, after qualifying as a lawyer, became an aid worker in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Cambodia and Vietnam. No secret then that Louise ordered the tofu curry for dinner. She's worked with activists on violence against women and various human rights issues, and these experiences inspired Louise for her fabulous 2022 young adult novel that came out in August last year called The Hidden Girl. We'll hear more about that later. It was shortlisted for the Ampersand Prize. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, that's a prize run by Hardy Grant Publishers that seeks out new young adult manuscripts. So, yeah, it was a real boon to get shortlisted by them at the time.
Fantastic, yeah. And your award-winning short fiction's also been published internationally. So can we call you an MPIA as well? A multi-published international author?
Maybe a junior one.
Okay, yeah. All right, okay. Not as many insignias as the other two. So, Alison, is it all okay if I call you Alison? Or
Absolutely, no, Alison's fine.
Okay. So, Alison is the author of the Harriet Gordon mysteries, and they're set in Asia. You worked or lived in Singapore for 3 years, and the Burmese gem trade is quite interesting.
Yes, it is. Yeah, that whole history of that.
And I believe there's a lot of criminal activity involved in Myanmar and Laos and various other countries where there's...
Still going on.
Yeah. So these are murder mysteries. It's not a YA, but it certainly can be read by young adults. Fabulous read. So you've enjoyed a long career, including as a lawyer. So you and Louise are people that are worth knowing if they're still working in the trade. So without further ado, let's really put them under the spotlight. So, Ellie, your book's set in Arlington in Virginia in the US.
Yes.
What inspired you to set that novel there, and what's your experience in the US? And
Oh, okay. Starting with something small. Well, we were mid-quarantine, during the dark times of which we shall not speak, and I had finished writing a serial killer thriller called None Shall Sleep, which did very well. That was a lot of fun to write that book, None Shall Sleep, but it was also fairly gruesome, and I wanted to write something that I knew would be a standalone and that it would be a little bit have a little bit more room, so it was for the characters, I guess, because in a thriller you tend to write the characters on the run, and I wanted to write a mystery story that gave me a little bit more room to develop the story of the people in the story without needing 3 books. and I started reading a book called Code Girls, which was about the female code breakers who were involved in the US during World War II in both the Army and the Navy facilities there. And I don't know if you've probably already watched this show. Does anybody remember the show The Bletchley Circle? Yes. Yes. So that was set in the UK, and that was about code breakers during World War II who'd worked at Bletchley Park. And then many years later, after they'd all gone back, they'd left, the war was over, and they'd returned to their normal lives and, sort of settled back into keeping their secret, because a lot of code breakers at that time, all the code breakers weren't allowed to talk about the work that they did. And then in the Bletchley Circle, they all got back together to solve a mystery. And I thought, well, immediately my instinct is always, well, how can we do something like this but with teenagers? And then I started reading more about it and digging into Bletchley Park, which was fascinating. I found out about how 70% of the workforce at Bletchley Park was female and how the average age was 19. And I thought, okay, well, that's a pretty good place to kick off when you want to introduce teenage characters. And then I started reading this book, Code Girls by Liza Mundy, and it was about the US code-breaking efforts and the women who were involved. And there was a line in that book that was like, and then the Army appropriated Arlington Hall, which was just outside of Washington, D.C., which used to be a young ladies' finishing school. So I was like, okay, that's it. That's my entry point for the story. So now I'm off to the races, and I can introduce teenage girls who used to live and study at the school and draw them into the code-breaking world, and then throw a serial killer into the mix, because, why not? I mean, yeah, it wouldn't be a crime story without a good murder.
Well, you don't want to waste your mortuary research.
No, I really don't. So I had actually written The Killing Code, from my living room in Australia, and I wrote None Shall Sleep in Australia, and and then I've written the sequel to None Shall Sleep, which comes out in June. So I wrote those 3 books before I finally did visit America last year. And I think setting them in historical time periods definitely helps. But
because it's 1942 or 3 in your novel, isn't it?
Yeah, in The Killing Code it's 43, and in None Shall Sleep and Some Shall Break it's 1982. So, yeah.
So, Alison, you've gone further back in time. You've gone back to 1910 in Singapore.
I have.
So, have you got relatives, or did you rely on archives, or what tempted you to write about 1910 Singapore?
Well, to begin with, history is me. I love anything historical, and I was very fortunate in 2000. As a family, we moved to Singapore with my husband's work, which left me basically unemployed for 3 years. So I cast around looking for various different things to do with myself, and joined a writers group, and that was all good. But for fun, as one does, I went to the National Library, and I was looking through microfiche of the Straits Times, which is the main newspaper in Singapore, and on the front page of a 1905 edition, I think it was this fairly large ad, it was like 3 inches by 3 inches. An English woman undertakes shorthand and typing, and on it went, absolute secrecy and confidentiality assured. And this ad just jumped out at me, and I didn't immediately start thinking about it until some years later, when I realised that it was actually the basis for an amazing protagonist, Harriet Gordon. Shorthand and typing, absolute secrecy, guaranteed. Why would she be in Singapore? What was she doing there? And so I gradually started. I'm a pantser, so if anybody knows what that means, so I just generally fly by the seat of my pants. But I had to kind of world build Singapore in 1910, and really have an idea of how it worked, far more than I've ever had to do for any of my other books. And of course, I'm very fortunate that there's a lot of photographic evidence and things like that I drew on, and an amazing map, a contemporaneous map of the time. And yes, I sort of I have recreated that colonial world of the early 1900s, and I have to say, in Singapore in 1910, absolutely nothing happened. So, it was a sort of a green field I could do as much as I liked with. I mean, I think the most exciting thing that happened was the opening of a breach, which is in the book, and I could just populate it with my characters. And so the main character is Harriet Gordon, and she has a male protagonist as well, who's an inspector of police, Robert Curran, and they're the continuation. Them and all their friends and relatives, and the world that they live in is the continuation across what will be a 4-book series. So 3 books are done, and I'm writing the 4th at the moment. So that's where that comes from.
Great, thanks Alison. And what about you, Louise? You've set yours in Australia and Indonesia.
Yeah, that's right, Janice. So the inspiration for me really came from living and working in Indonesia. As Janice said, I was there as an aid worker, and it was a very intense time of my life, but also in Indonesian history. And then got back to Australia and tried to tell people about it, and they were like, oh yeah, that's nice, and sort of changed topics. I was talking to Alison about this with her Singapore experience. So I think that was a bit of the seed, wanting to share that sort of visceral travel living experience of being in another culture. And I think living and learning about that culture gave me the confidence to then have that as a setting along with Melbourne. So the book's set in Yogyakarta mainly, and around there as well as Melbourne. And also it's the subject matter of the story. When I was working in aid work, I met some women who were survivors of trafficking and heard their stories when I was working with women who are activists to try and eliminate violence against women. And these stories just had a really huge impact on me. It wasn't like I necessarily worked with these women that much, but I think some stories just sort of seep into your subconscious and linger there until you're down at your writing desk and it comes out at some stage. So, and I think also writing for Australian young adult market, there's so many connections between Australia and Indonesia, but you don't really see that in our fiction or literature. You often see people from other cultures coming to Australia and having to adapt to Australian culture, but you don't kind of see it the other way around. So the main character in my story, Melati Nelson, she's got some Indonesian heritage, but she's out of touch with it, but she's going back to Indonesia on a school trip and connecting with that heritage too, and having to adapt to it. So it's really the other way around. So I did find that quite curious that, we don't have more of that, particularly in Australian young adult fiction.
So how many people have read Louise's book? Okay, a couple. And how many have read Alison's book? Heaps. There you go, Alison. You'll be going around signing autographs shortly. And how many have read Ellie's book? Okay. On the pile. Somebody said. So it's sometimes hard to ask questions at these sorts of things without being a spoiler a bit.
Is that icon? Yeah. It is.
Oh, maybe, is it getting feedback?
Yeah. Oh, I just turned this on. Sorry, darling.
What about if you put it on the floor?
It's off now.
Okay. Thanks, Carmel. So, writing historical fiction and writing it set in other countries, although yours is contemporary, of course, Louise, is a bit of a challenge, I think, because since 1910 and since 1943, cultures have changed incredibly in terms of how we portray people in other cultures. So how did you deal with that, do you think, Louise? How did you deal with the English diaspora, the colonials? I mean, your protagonist, Robert Cowan, the cop, he had a relationship with a native woman.
I think that's me.
What did I say?
Louise.
Oh, sorry. It's definitely you, Alison.
Is your inspector the same?
Yeah, no. They didn't write the same names in their novels. So you traverse quite a lot of class and social issues, I think, in the depiction of Singapore. So how did you, was it nice to set that in 1910 as opposed to 2022, or?
Well, as I said, I write historical fiction, so there was no question of me ever setting it in the 2000s. Look, it's difficult. We live in a post-colonial world, and writing novels set in colonial times, I took a risk, and I thought, my gosh, I'm going to get a lot of blowback on this. But mercifully, I haven't, because I hope what I've done is actually tried to show a balance, because there were. I find these days when I watch programs, I think there was one set in India, in Darjeeling area, and all the European characters were universally horrible. And they were really, really bad. People are not like that. There are good people and there are bad people in every society. And look, to be honest, I come from a colonial background myself. My grandparents settled in Kenya in the 1920s. So we talk about writing own voices. I am writing my own voice. That was the background I came from. But I saw the way that they my parents and my grandparents sort of interacted and their views of the country that they lived in, and they adored Kenya. I mean, my father mourned Kenya to his dying day that he'd had to leave. My grandfather eradicated malaria on Lake Victoria. So I couldn't write a story in which all the Anglo characters were bad, or that all the non-Anglo characters are bad. There are good and bad people, but I did want to demonstrate, and it comes out probably more in the second book, that were really awful people. There were really awful people. There's a character called Ellis in the second book who beats his coolies and nearly kills them, and those people, that was all drawn from real accounts. So that happened, and I'm not going to go past it, but I'm not going to be an apologist for it, and I'm not going to be a revisionist either. I mean, history is history, and I'm a firm believer that I'm not going to rewrite history just because it is our history, and we have to understand where we came from in order to move forward. So yes, writing Singapore in 1910, it was a colonial time. Yes, the non-Anglo characters tended to take a secondary role anyway. I don't think the first sergeant of police was appointed in Singapore until the 1920s, if not the 1930s. So I couldn't sort of suddenly have Sergeant Singh be appointed to being an inspector of police, because that just didn't happen. He was always going to be a sergeant of police. So yes, I tread that line. I'm very conscious of treading that line, and all I do is hope that I do it in a fair and even-handed manner.
Thanks. And Ellie, you also traverse some of those issues with the black girl, Violet
Delac,
as well as Kathleen, who became Kit.
yes,
Having been almost treated the same as a lot of black women were at the time, put into service or sold into service by her impoverished parents, really.
Yeah, it was a kind of indentured labour in the 40s. So there's four girls in the story. One of them comes from, they all come from fairly modest backgrounds, but the lead character of Kit Sutherland it's not a spoiler to say that she's impersonating somebody else of a higher social class, because, that happens in the first couple of pages of the book. It was interesting seeing what conditions were like for women who were basically indentured labour during the late 30s and early 40s, and it was pretty shit. It was interesting also to sort of see the conditions for black women and black workers during that time period as well. And it was fascinating to see how much opportunity World War II provided for women in those situations, because suddenly, every worker was an important worker, and black women and lower class or working class women were being paid more appropriately for their work. And everyone, to some extent in a place like Arlington Hall, they had everybody from, they had one of the characters, Dottie's the daughter of a grocer, and then they had other women who had come from upper middle class backgrounds who were debutantes, and everyone who worked at the hall they all worked the same hours and earned the same pay, basically. And everyone was so it was a kind of a leveller, I guess, to some extent. But even with that levelling, there was still a certain amount of stratification. So there was a segregated black unit of code breakers that worked in Arlington Hall at that time, and it was actually really hard to find information about these women because none of their names were recorded. So while there was quite a lot of information about the women who worked within Arlington Hall, the black segregated unit, they were called the commercial unit. So they were actually code breaking commercial codes, because while the US was engaged in war with Japan, they were also doing business with Mitsubishi. So, they had to make sure that their commercial interests were being taken care of, and it was the women who'd been drawn from, in some situations, from the kitchens to work in the black code breaking unit that actually examined those codes. And that unit was supervised by a man called William Coffey, who started at Arlington Hall as a janitor. And because he was the only man who was liaising between the code-breaking upper echelons in the hall and the black workers, he became the de facto coordinator or organiser of that unit. And so, it was a fascinating time period because the war created so much social upheaval. It was, for the first time, it created conditions for women of all types that created huge changes in lifestyle and in opportunity. So for the first time, women were allowed to wear pants. They were allowed to work outside the home. They were allowed to earn their own money, live independently, and for queer women, they were allowed to congregate together in a way that didn't immediately, cast suspicion on them. So it was uniquely levelling time, I think, even though a lot of that got rolled back in the 50s. The 40s was the spark, I guess, that kicked a lot of movements and social consciousness movements off.
Yeah, there's a comment in the book where one woman says, what are they going to do? Look at our panty girdles. And I actually found myself Googling the invention of the panty girdle.
It's a panty girdle.
Because I can recall when we got rid of suspender belts and we put on these things that we used to call killer Kowalskis because they hugged you so tightly, and they were made out of elasticized lycra, but they were more satiny in America in the 1940s, so I don't know how come they didn't get exported here.
Rubber was in short supply. Rubber was being used for the war efforts. There were a lot of rubber and elastic, they had to find substitutes for that. So, yeah.
That's because the Japanese were in Singapore.
That's right. That's because the Japanese were in Singapore. And no silk. No silk blouses, and, anything nylon was really hard to get too.
Yes, drawing the lines up the back of the leg to imitate stockings. And I loved all that detail, and I loved all your comments about the women, there'd be in a sage cardigan or a brown travelling skirt. I still don't know what a travelling skirt is, but it sounds like it's a very practical garment, and maybe we should have more of them.
We should.
So, your people in Indonesia, the cafe owner and the chain-smoking woman who was charged with looking after Mel, who continually got herself into trouble both at school in Melbourne as well as Indonesia, so she was grounded and had to do copious amounts of homework in a coffee shop where the bloke plied everybody with, it sounded like delicious coffee, and the woman who was watching her would just go out into the courtyard and smoke. So is that sort of where Indonesian society's at the moment in terms of class?
I'm not sure about that currently, but it's definitely my experience that I my working life there was in a sort of miasma of cigarette smoke every time I moved through firewells or, went down the stairwell. It became a bit of a joke, me waving my way through it as a fairly ardent non-smoker. There was a copious amount of coffee and ginger tea they get plied with as well. Just to give people who haven't read it, which is most of the room, a bit of a nutshell summary. It's mystery crime thriller set in Melbourne and Indonesia, and it's the story of Melati Nelson, who's got a delinquent past and is pretending to be a model student at a new school. But then she uncovers a life-threatening secret in an Indonesian teenage girl's diary, and that's where her problems start. She's really got to decide if she's going to act and seek justice for this young woman called Debbie, and that's what takes her on the journey to Indonesia and back streets of Melbourne as well. So just to give people a bit of context there.
Yeah, I love the brothel scene. That was great.
I won't get into spoilers there, but it does, it does involve sex trafficking. So, it gets to some of the nastier aspects of Melbourne sex industry.
I mean, all of these novels could be read very... or read by young adults. There's no swearing and blood and guts in Alison's. It could definitely be read by 14, 15-year-olds as well. I think there's very important messages in all of these novels for all of us and young readers as well. Could I ask you now to read a little bit from your books, please? Alison, do you want to go first?
The brief was to find a part of the book that actually demonstrates the importance of the setting as a character. And Singapore is, as you can probably feel at the moment, a very important part of the setting. I sort of had as a byline for a while, truth and corpses decompose quickly in Singapore. So has everybody been to Singapore at some point in their lives? Yeah. Well, even the airports. You walk out, it's like walking into soft, warm cotton wool. There are 3 seasons: hot, hotter, and hottest. So how these women wore corsets and no air conditioning, I don't know. So just as back, this is actually chapter 2. So in the first chapter, Harriet Gordon, the shorthand typist and stenographer and failed suffragette, has just found her employer dead. So we're now meeting Robert Curran, who's the policeman. Runnels of sweat trickled down the back of Inspector Robert Curran's neck, softening the stiff starched collar of his uniform. He took off his helmet and wiped his forehead with a handkerchief before turning his attention to the old colonial plantation house. Time and the elements had not been kind to the once proud structure that bore a crudely painted sign above the steps leading up to the veranda. Mandalay. a name that conjured up the romance and mystique of Burma, not this neglected building. Dark green moss stretched over the weathered timber like the grasping fingers of the jungle, eager to reclaim the building back into the forest. Several windows were missing shutters, and on others they swung crookedly on rusty hinges. Even from where he stood, he could see the veranda floor had warped from the constant humidity. A pony trap guarded by a young Malay boy stood in the shade of a rain tree some distance from the house. Avoiding a large puddle in the rutted driveway, a remnant of the morning rainstorms, Curran approached the boy. The lad bobbed his head, his hand stroking the nose of a skewbald pony, whose ears twitched unhappily as a large drop of moisture landed squarely on the white patch between his eyes. In his fluent Malay, Curran asked the boy his name. Aziz Tuan, the boy replied. His gaze darted to the veranda. I told the mem this was a bad place. Bukit Hantu is a place of bad spirits. Can I take the mem and go home? Not just yet. Curran gave the boy a reassuring smile. I need to speak to the mem. You just wait here. He turned towards the house, pacing the distance in easy strides. What had the boy called the place? Bukit Hantu? The haunted hill? He made a mental note to ask one of the Malay constables how the place had acquired that name. The name on his notes just read Newbold, Mandalay. He approached the steps leading up to the veranda. Beyond the wide expanse of warped and broken boards, the front door stood open, but the bulk of his sergeant, Kusharan Singh, loomed out of the gloom, obscuring any view into the house. Who found the body? He asked Singh. She did, sir. His sergeant indicated a European woman who sat bolt upright in a rattan armchair on the veranda, her hands clutching a leather handbag. A fall of pink bougainvillea that climbed across the veranda and threatened to engulf the house had hidden her from sight. The woman looked up at him from beneath a sensible pith helmet swathed in a net, and he had an impression of a youngish woman with brown hair coiled, as was the fashion, at the nape of her neck. She wore a plain white high-necked blouse fastened with a brooch at her throat, and a skirt of an indeterminate dark colour. A thoroughly respectable woman who seemed at odds with the decayed house. Beneath a complexion far too unfashionably browned to have ever graced his aunt's drawing room, she looked grey and drawn. Although he was yet to view the corpse, Curran knew it would be no sight for the faint-hearted. It surprised him a woman had not succumbed to the vapours. Instead, she sat waiting for him, pale but perfectly composed. What's her name? Gordon, Mrs. Harriet Gordon, Singh said.
Now, doesn't that want to make you rush off to Raffles and have a Singapore sling? It did me.
Not if there are dead bodies.
Well, to leave them behind. Do you want to read something, Ellie?
Sure. Except you've upped the ante, Alison. You're doing the voices. Oh. Do I have to do the voices? My American accent is very bad. Pardon me. Okay, so the four girls in the story are Kit, Dottie, Moya and Violet, and they're meeting a reporter. They've left Arlington Hall on a field trip and they're meeting a reporter who may have some information for them about the most recent murder victim. The problem that they're facing at the moment is that a series of murders is taking place in Washington, D.C., and all of the victims are government girls. So all the women who worked in D.C. at that time, there was about 200,000 of them all flooded in to D.C. in the first few years of the war, and they didn't have enough room for them all. So in this scene, they've left the hall and they're catching the bus in to meet this reporter. The bus lumbers up 17th Street Northwest and Dottie forges a path to the door so they can exit at the next stop. When they finally manage to alight from the bus onto the pavement, Kit finds she can breathe a little easier. The night breeze is crisp and the city doesn't smell particularly clean, but the mix of scents is intriguing. The tang of exhaust, the iron smell of asphalt, the faint whiff of garbage, the lilt of women's perfume. Kit sets her clothes to rights. How do we get to the Hay Adams from here? Okay, that's H Street. Dotty points. We go right and it's 2 blocks that away. You know your way around the city. Dotty grins. I borrowed that map, remember? Come on. She leads forward, demonstrating how to navigate the sidewalk and the city traffic crisscrossing nearby. There are plenty of people around. Waves girls, groups of dressed-up matrons, older men in suits. The concrete underfoot is damp from an earlier sprinkle of rain, and the street lamps and hoardings are glittering in the dark. Evening DC is a kingdom of dreams, and Kit takes it all in. But there's the occasional flash of reality. Old posters with drawings of angry male workers raising their fists, and the slogan, "Fire women, hire men," blare right next to other posters exhorting, "Man the guns, join the Navy." Kit follows Dot determinedly, ignoring the bite in her feet from the sandal straps. Who do you think this reporter is, the one we're meeting? Now that is a mystery. Maybe Moya knew him from when she worked in notifications or something. Kit remembers Moya's soft, reflective murmur in the library. But it's been years, she said. Somehow, I don't think so. Then he must be an old friend of Moya's. Dotty gestures to encourage Kit to cross over near Lafayette Square so they're not walking in an unlit area. I guess we'll find out. Another half a block, then the great white edifice of the hotel is rising up from among the other buildings, grand and imposing. Before they reach the corner of 16th Street, Kit spots the illuminated entry to the hotel's basement. A discreet golden plaque reveals that the bar is called Off the Record, a thoroughly appropriate name for a place where they're meeting a reporter. A smartly dressed couple goes down the stairs. Murmurs and music exit in the backwash of the door being opened and closed. Do we just go on in? Kit scans the street. Or do we wait for Violet? I don't know. Dotty pulls her shawl wrap closer. She and Kit both have wraps against the evening chill. I think we just go in. Violet might have already arrived, and it's freezing out here. They pinch their cheeks for colour and descend the stairs.
During the whole of this novel, Kit has to walk in another woman's shoes that are half a size too small.
Yeah, she's always wearing her imposter shoes throughout the entire story. How many people here have been to Washington, D.C. or, yeah? So a lot of you recognise it. So I had to write without ever going to Washington, D.C. and trying to imagine what it looked like back in 1943. But luckily there is a lot of photo documentation because, and a lot of the city was actually being built around then. It was like, that was the year the Pentagon went up, you know, that was the year Arlington Cemetery was, you know, they hadn't kind of built that yet. All of that was all still under development. There were a few things like the Lincoln Memorial and various bridges and things like that there, but a lot of the landmarks that we might recognise now in DC just didn't yet exist.
And didn't they build the Pentagon on a former
black community? Yeah.
Community, yeah.
Yeah, they cleared out the Green Valley housing community there, which was an all-black. Well, it was distinctive not because it was one of the only black communities in the state, but it was also distinctive because it was a community of free men. So it was former slaves who'd been freed, who developed their own community in this area, and when they were looking for a suitable location for the Pentagon, they mysteriously picked this spot. So they just kicked them all out, and yeah, they had to go and find other places nearby. But it broke up a potentially politically, it was probably politically expedient as well, because it broke up a potential, you know, voting bloc of freed men who lived in that state. Yeah. Yeah, and Virginia was still segregated. There were parts of Virginia which were still segregated. The buses were still segregated in Virginia, and then you'd cross the Potomac and you were in Washington, D.C., which was desegregated because of the war. So, yeah, it was a very tricky time.
I imagine it was. Louise, do you want to read to us about Indonesia, please?
Sure, Janice. To give you a bit of context here, this is a passage where the main character, Melati, and her friend Michael, they're in Yogyakarta and they've snuck out on a night hike to see Merapi volcano, which is a bit of a lifelong dream of Melati's, to see this volcano in action. And they're with a guide called Rusli and his mates, and with a Kiwi tourist as well. They've climbed up a neighbouring mountain and sort of having a bit of nap there till Merapi snaps into action. So we're just at that point now. Miss Melati, Mr. Michael, wake up. It begins. My eyes snap open. Rusli is crouching in front of us, lighting a cigarette. Amir and his mates fold up their blankets and one of them prods the snoring Kiwi, who wakes with a snort. You are lucky. Sometimes all this and nothing, or only at sunrise, Rusli says. We stand up and stare into the darkness and stretch. Rusli holds up his hand and watches the groaning darkness, like a captain steering us towards land. We're all silent now. I tune into the night and something catches in my throat when I hear it. It's faint, the barest of sounds, like a kettle warming up. Then the rumblings begin and start to roll in steadier waves. Merapi splutters, cracks and pops, a strange primal language. As the lava rises, the volcano spits and groans. A whiff of sulphur creeps around us, like smoke from a stick of incense. The first molten burst of lava catapults into the night sky, brands it with red-hot spray and splashes down the mountain with terrifying speed. It slows to a glowing, knotted rope. We whoop and I jump on the spot. Oh my God, look at that, Michael says, his mouth open and his eyes on fire. Unbelievable, I say. In the cold night, electricity fills my body. More lava shoots out and chases the first molten rope until the night is alive with smoke and glowing rivers scar the mountain. Michael and the Kiwis' faces shine, lava reflected in their eyes.
Thanks, Louise. I like the way that Melati's father is also, he's inspired her with a love of volcanology, hasn't he? And he sort of travels around the world as an aid worker.
Yeah, that's right. He's sort of more on the emergency crisis management side of things, so always travelling around. And there's a photo of her as a toddler where he's taken her to see Mount Bromo and sort of has her threateningly poised over the crater for the sake of the photo. I've got to admit, I indulged in a bit of volcano climbing myself when I was there, and that really fascinated me about that part of the world. So, yeah, it was nice to sort of bring that experience into the book, and I was lucky enough to see Merapi in action too. So, yeah, having those sort of vivid experiences are kind of gold for a writer.
Didn't Steve Irwin hold one of his newborn children over a crocodile or something?
Michael Jackson over the border.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
So this is something that dads do. Yeah. Great. Are you going to have a market, an international market for your book, do you think, Louise?
Well, I have had some international readers writing into me and doing reviews. It's available digitally or through Book Depository overseas, but at the moment it's, only published in Australia and New Zealand in hard copy form. So, we'll have to see. I did go to the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival with it in October last year, which was pretty amazing to go to Bali with it. So it felt like a bit of a homecoming in some ways. ways, taking it there. So a little bit of interest from Indonesian publishers, but you never know how polite people are being or how keen they actually are. So I think it's just something you kind of leave to the publishing gods and hope for the best.
Well, the publishing gods in Australia seem to be shrinking their publishing. Is that correct? It's not correct.
I don't think so.
Just seems like that for some of us, I suppose.
I think it's in a state of flux, but I think it's...
But the market, for instance, in the US is much bigger, isn't it?
Yeah.
So is that why, Ellie and Alison, you're published in the US?
I'm published in the US because I couldn't find a publisher here in Australia, but I did find both Agent and Penguin in the US who were happy to publish me. However, the publishing industry in the US is in an absolute mess at the moment. And my problem is the opposite of Louise's, in that my book was published in the US but not sold into Australia. So that's why you've never heard of me before. My books were never in bookshops or anything like that. So it's a very frustrating world. Penguin, as I said, had bought the first 3 books and then decided they weren't going to take the 4th one, and which is the last one in the series. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that, and it's to do with COVID, it's to do with booksellers, it's to do with the politics of the place at the moment as well. Whereas the Australian I'm published by HarperCollins in another series here, and there's no sign of that letting up at all. So I would say the Australian publishing industry is quite strong.
I think you're still limited to some extent. It's an issue of population and scale. Yeah. You know, like...
1 million readers.
Yeah, that's a lot. But, you know, like in Australia, 10,000 books is, you know, pretty much a bestseller. And, you know, I'm selling probably 3 times, 4 times as many as that in the States. So it's...
ditto.
Yeah, so it's... it sort of comes down to you reach a bit of a ceiling, I think, in Australia with if you're only publishing to the local market. So it necessitates looking further afield. And while I would like to feel like there's a broader market within the EU, you know, where the books could go out to European markets, that seems to be a bit hit and miss. So at the moment, my biggest direct market is the States. So I'm selling direct to the States now. I have a US agent. I'm selling directly to US publishers and then reselling back to Australian markets, to Australian publishers.
You're lucky you've got that. The UK, I would say, is a closed shop completely.
UK is a closed shop. Yeah.
Never had any luck getting into the UK.
They have their own little microcosm of authors and stuff that we've never heard of.
There are a few of that historical fiction authors who managed to be published in the US.
You can, it's a real one-off thing though. It's very difficult to get published in the UK. Yep. So the US is the biggest market, direct market at the moment,
Is that something that you'd recommend for people to pursue, to seek out publishing opportunities in the US? We've got a lot of Australian women writers whose settings are so Australian. I'm looking at you, Vicky, and of course the many others. Your book doesn't sound Australian to me so much. I mean, I know it's written by you, an Australian. Your book certainly didn't sound to me like an Australian, Alison. I think your book did sound like an Australian to me,
Yeah, I'd say definitely very much to the Australian and Indonesian markets. So, when I hear Ellie saying that, it's, very appealing for someone with one book out to start thinking of the American market, but then I feel a bit torn too because, say, a manuscript I'm working on at the moment is very much set in the Australian bush and I really want that in there. So if that doesn't translate, I guess maybe it depends on what story you want to tell and whether that's one better placed in one market or another.
Sorry, I didn't know if you had something to say on this, but I was just going to say, you know, the National Cultural Policy was just announced the other day, in which they're going to start supporting the Australia Council and things like that, and they canvassed all of the authors who were invited to put submissions in, and basically there's nothing for literature. There's no government support for literature in this country, you know. That makes it very, very difficult if you want to pursue a career in literature to continue to stay faithful to, you know, oh, well, I'll continue to set my books in Australia with Australian characters. It's like, well, I can't do that, and I've still got to eat, you know. So I would put my own submission in and said, well, look, you know, until we start getting some investment in the literary community within the country, which we haven't had for more than a decade, we're all going to be looking further afield. We're going to be forced to set our books outside of this country. We're going to, you know, I wrote 9 books set in Australia, and then, you know, when I published my 10th book in the US, set in the US with US characters, suddenly I could make a living, and it makes a pretty big difference, you know, when you've been in the industry for 10 years.
And UK authors are down to £14,000.
Yeah.
And it's only...
I think it's about $11,000 a year for Australian authors right now.
So that is well below.
Yeah, well below livable wage.
I was going to add to that I also dabble in the romance writing field, and there are very few romance writers in Australia who look at the Australian market. Their eyes are firmly fixed on the outside market, and they're doing incredibly well.
Do you think that's too, Alison, because nobody's really local anymore with the internet, with selling Kindle?
Well, having said that,
selling digitally.
My agent has looked me in the eye and told me that she has no interest in my Australian books or any Australian settings. So there we go. I've put a book to her that has Australian characters, and I only put it to her out of politeness, and she said, "Oh, well, it's not set in Australia, so yes, send it to me." So that's just one agent. I can't answer for everybody else, and I know that there are some Australian writers doing very well with Australian settings in America, but I do think, as I said, coming from the background I come from, I'm always looking outside Australia. I'm sorry.
And this is a real issue, isn't it? Because if we can't tell our own stories in our own country and have them published, where do we go as a cultural nation? I know that Canada has certainly subsidised their authors in a big way in the past, and certainly the reason why we're all very familiar with what we call Nordic noir is because of the huge funds that those governments made available for translation and printing in the English-speaking markets, because they see that having their stories on a world stage is very important. You know, when you go to the airport in Reykjavik in Iceland, they have a room almost this big, just full of Icelandic writers with a few Swedes and Danes and Norwegians chucked in.
Yeah.
Whereas here you go to the airport and you can get Joe Nesbo and I won't go on.
Prince Harry.
Less said about that, the better. I mean, look, this isn't something that's happened like in the last couple of years. When my first book was published in 2013, Every Breath, and it was on, I think it was 2014 or early 2015, it was on, you know, one of the national most popular borrowed books lists in for libraries in the country, which was great. But, you know, it was me and Marcus Zusak that were the only two YA authors represented on that list in 2015. And, you know, do you know how many authors have been on that list between 2015 and 2023?
1?
0. Oh. There are no Australian YA authors represented on most borrowed lists in libraries in this country. If you go into a bookstore, there are somewhere between 7 and 9 overseas buy-ins on the shelf for every Australian YA book published. That was in 2015. It's probably worse now. So that's what I guess you're contending with.
Look, I think I've got a slightly different experience. Sorry, I'm sort of monopolising, but I write Australian historicals, and I think my publisher, HarperCollins, actually did very well. It's sort of, I think we are now ready to hear certainly our own history told in our own voices, and that's why they've now got a stable of me and Taya Cooper and Derry Fraser and Victoria Perman, all telling fabulous Australian historical fiction stories, and we're all Australians, and Taya particularly I know has sold into the US, so you know it does happen.
I'd love to see more of it. I just wish it was more supported.
Yeah, well, my book
on a state, federal
my
level.
book's not in the airport. I checked.
Yeah.
I think we might have a break now, so... So what we're going to do now is you are going to chuck all sorts of questions at Ellie, Alison and Louise. So off you go.
And you've got to say your name. And
Oh yes, it's a good idea to say your name.
I finished my...
And Jill's waiting with bated breath to judge the best question.
I'm about to finish my line, so I might be able to give coherent answers.
Last one.
Thank you. Getting confused by the silence.
Yeah. This is not for Alison. Turn it on, don't you?
Okay.
And your name?
My name's Michael. It's for Alison. I heard what you said about adjusting your writing according to current political needs. I just wondered, even though you said you've got no negative feedback, has that influenced your content nevertheless?
No, not really. As I said, I write characters. I write people as I believe people are. What I have had to do, what I have been required to do by my editor, is basically put an apology at the start of every book to sort of say, I am writing about colonial Singapore, and there are going to be things you're not going to like about it, or whatever. And but as I said, really, I can probably count the number of negative reviews on one hand. So whatever I've done sort of seems to work okay with people. But I'm not going to. As I said, I like to write about people. I'm not trying to write about the politics of what was going on at all.
That's content warning.
Yeah, content warning. Yeah.
Interesting.
So my question is to Ellie, recognising that Washington DC is primarily an Afro-American population. I haven't read your book, so I wanted to understand more about how you portrayed the issues for Afro-Americans, recognising that it was back in 1943 and recognising the history of DC.
What's your name, please?
Oh, my name is Anne.
Thanks, Anne. It was just a lot of research. There was a lot of online research with African American library societies and historical societies within DC and Virginia. There was a lot of research. Like I said, a lot of the information about black code breakers who worked for the war effort in DC at that time, a lot of that just doesn't exist. There's been some efforts to recover the names of the people who worked in that industry, and there's more research continuing to be done. It was also just a matter of reading up about the time period and what the situation was like for black citizens of DC and Virginia at that time. Look, I feel like I did a lot of reading and not all of it made it into the book, as you would all know that you can't insert a big long diatribe about things. You just try and make little suggestions here and there, like the idea that when Violet gets on the bus, she immediately moves to the segregated seats at the back of the bus, and the women that she works with, the young women she works with, are like, one of them says, well, why are you sitting there? Oh, no, she goes to sit down next to her and she says, Violet says, you can't sit here. This is the segregated section. And she says, well, this is ridiculous. You know, like, she said, you just move one seat forward and I'm not in the segregated section anymore and I'm still talking to you over the back of the seat. And she was like, yeah, well, you know, and then I was kind of like, well, I wanted to make Violet more angry about all of this stuff, but then I realised that actually she would just be angry all the time. So what I ended up doing was kind of writing her in a way that normalised this for her. So instead of saying to her friend, oh yeah, you know, this is terrible, she was sort of saying, well, look, you're just going to make trouble for me. You know, like, think about how this could complicate my life, the impact of your actions, no matter how indignant you might feel about the segregation on the bus. This is it's going to impact me. It's not going to impact you. But you know, I was also very aware that civil rights movement was coming to a head around that time. There was a lot of fairly serious suppression around that time, but there was still, like, the March on Washington, you know, didn't take place, but it could easily have taken place if FDR hadn't changed the rules around desegregating the military. So, and you know, when it came down to it, America needed every able-bodied person that they could get working for the war effort. So that did change the dynamic, I think, for black politics about that time. But yeah, it was really fascinating to read about this stuff, just as it was fascinating to read about the situation for queer women at that time. All of these little hidden kind of alcoves that you end up going into, you know, to find out what's going on, or what were the little secrets. You kind of have to find out some of this stuff even if it doesn't make it into the story. You have to know it so that you can write the characters authentically, so that you can write them the way that they would actually potentially act. Yeah.
I'll just ask a quick one first, Vicky. Louise, I'm just wondering what you might be working on next, because the other two are prolific and we know what they've done and we know where they're probably going, but what are you doing next?
It's another crime thriller, but it's a survival one set in an Australian bush juvenile justice boot camp. Whoa. So, yeah, closer to home, a bit more of a body count. So, yeah, that's what I'm up to at the moment.
Come up to Malmesbury, you can research it up. Find out what's going on.
A little bit more remote than that, but yeah, there would be a bit of inspiration there.
Yeah.
My name is Vicky, and my question is for all of you. If you were asked by the Australia Council or the government how to boost the publishing industry in Australia, what's kind of one thing that you would... I'm just thinking of when Sizzle Jo Garzen came out, and she was telling us, and she was one of the Nordic writers, and she said when you release a book in like Denmark, the government automatically bought the first 3,500 and sent them free to libraries, and that there was subsidies. And I remember just going, oh my God. So, you know, what would you all recommend to boost? I already said that. You can't have that one.
Go.
I think that'd be a great start, but things like a living wage, if that was possible for authors, whether
UBI.
selective program or more universal. But yeah, that's quite a utopian dream at the moment.
Sounds really good though.
Yeah, 3,500 books bought by the government, that would just make such a difference. As long as it didn't go into pulp and into the freeways.
Okay, my suggestion would be, we already have digital lending rights now. That has just been announced. That's the first time that Australian authors are getting digital lending rights, which is amazing. And I would reinstitute, and I was just talking to Katie about this, I would reinstitute Reading Matters, which was an amazing conference for booksellers, librarians, publishers, teachers, librarians, teachers, authors, and, sales reps. Everybody used to get together. There was a big network of people that used to communicate, exchange ideas, talk about programs that they would run to promote and advocate for literature on the ground in schools and in libraries. And all of that infrastructure that used to exist was dismantled when the funding ran out, 10 years ago, 8 years ago. So yeah, it would be really nice to see some of that infrastructure start to come back. Yeah.
And my suggestion would be that there should be at least $1 per head per Australian to be spent on Australian writers. So that'd be 25 mil for a start, and we just don't have that at the moment.
Sounds great.
Louise. Oh, my name, Celia. Indonesia is a very diverse country, and you've written about a girl who's gone back who has Indonesian heritage, and I haven't read your book yet. How much of her Indonesian heritage does she learn about before she goes there through her family here?
She's kind of had past learning about her family because she lived as a young child in Bandung in Java, so she's got that sort of memory of that, but it's not a really active part of her life now, other than she's got talent with Indonesian language, and that's sort of something that's really seen her through some bad times and quite a strength there. But through the process of going on this trip to Indonesia with the school to improve her Indonesian, she reconnects really with that heritage and learns a bit more about her grandmother, who is where her Indonesian heritage comes from, and feels more connected to that. And as she's working on trying to uncover where this Indonesian teenage girl in the diary is, she's really tapping into that side of her heritage. So it's sort of a journey back to those roots, really, I guess I would say. But not a lot before she left. It's really about rediscovering that heritage. Yeah. Thanks, Celia.
There's an awful lot in Louise's novel about friendships and bullying in schools and that feeling of sexual attraction, which I think came out in your book as well, Ellie, as well with you, Alison. But Harriet remains staunch. Yes. And I really like the fact that the conflict with parents, social class and stuff in your book came out quite clearly, because Mel was a scholarship girl and looked down upon by the bitch Libby. Libby, of course, was the first one to get murdered in Ellie's novel, but it wasn't the same character, unfortunately.
That character is named after a bookseller. She won during the bushfires, during the Australian bushfires. There was a big Authors for Fireys auction, and Libby Armstrong is the name of the proprietor of the beachside bookshop in Sydney, and she won the right to name a character in the raffle. So yes, killed off. Yeah,
At least she didn't offend you.
no, she didn't.
I mean, it's absolutely true. Be careful what you say. You may go in our next book.
Any more questions?
Mine actually isn't a question, it's a comment on the back of what was said before about libraries and digital rights and everything. My name's Katie and I work in libraries. So I just wanted to remind everyone in the audience that every time that you borrow a book or reserve a book or request a purchase at a library, that really does support the authors. So for every 4 or 5 reservations on a book, we buy another copy, and that money goes to authors as well as the lending rights that they get too. So we buy a lot of books in libraries. So I would just say, please reserve, even if you've got a copy, if you love that author, reserve it from your library too. It's absolutely worth doing in terms of income for authors. 100%. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, very much for coming along tonight. I think we've had a great evening, great discussion. I must say the food was pretty good too. Yeah. So well done, everybody. Well done, Sisters in Crime. Well done, Ellie.
Thank you.
And Louise and Alison.
And thank you, Janice.
My pleasure.
Janice.